For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. This man right here is Norb Hecker. He was the very first coach in the history of the Atlanta Falcons. And man, was he a terrible one. Like, genuinely awful. Never mind the fact that the Falcons hired him, even though no one around the league had recommended that he be a head coach. Over his time with the Falcons, he went 4-26-1, posting one of the worst winning percentages of any coach in NFL history. The Falcons finished the 1967 season with a 1-12-1 record, which was the worst of any team in football that season. And in 1968, Hecker was gone after just 3 games where the team started 0-3. He was never the head coach of any team ever again after that. And yeah, it's not too hard to see why. It was tough for any expansion team to do well at the start, and it usually took these teams back then a solid half-decade just to get off the ground and running and halfway competitive. Look at the Cowboys and the Vikings for one. But the Falcons were something else entirely under Hecker, as they were getting worse, as he made bad decision after bad decision as the man in charge. And today, we're going to talk about one of those awful moves on paper that just didn't seem to make any sense when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. Because I want you to imagine a team devoid of any talent cutting a player on their team that was talented and was one of the bright spots during their inaugural season in 1966, and giving an insanely backwards explanation that made no sense as to why they cut him. Well, that's exactly what happened in 1967 with the Atlanta Falcons and wide receiver Vern Burke, because apparently Norb Hecker had no idea how anything worked. Because this is the story behind one of the stupidest roster cuts in Atlanta Falcons history, and the starter who was cut for seemingly no reason whatsoever. Before I talk about the actual cut in question, and why it was so moronic in terms of the thought process and the justification behind it, we need some context to understand just who this man right here was, and how good of a player he was. The year is 1966, and the Atlanta Falcons are an expansion team in their first season in the NFL. And if you watched any Falcons game during that season, odds are you noticed this man right here, who was a regular in the starting lineup. This is Vern Burke. For his first 3 seasons in the NFL, he had a rather uneventful start to his career, as the 5th round pick by the San Francisco 49ers didn't do a whole lot, recording just 2 catches for 38 yards. During the preseason in 1966, he was placed on waivers, and the Falcons, needing some help in the passing game, decided to take a chance on him and see what the youngster could do. And it seemed that this move to the East Coast worked, because in 1966, it seemed as though he had found a home with the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons switched his position from tight end to wide receiver, or split end, thinking that he was a bit small to be a tight end, and thinking that his size and his weight would be better suited on the outside. This was one of the few smart things that the Falcons coaching staff did, because Burke immediately found comfort playing a position he hadn't played since his college days at Oregon State, and was so comfortable there that he ended up getting a spot on the first-string offense. Said Hecker on Burke, "Vern is a real hard worker. He catches the ball well, and has good speed and good moves." Well, that seems like everything you want to hear, and seems like the traits that a wide receiver should have. Works hard? Check. Good hands? Check. Good speed? Check. Good moves? Check. The complete package. The Falcons like this man a lot, and it's not hard to see why. By the time the 1966 season ended, Burke, despite not really playing and starting until the second half of the season, had 28 receptions for 348 yards. His 28 catches was the 3rd most on the team, and his 348 yards was the 2nd most on the team, only behind veteran wideout Alex Hawkins. And Burke had a lot of solid performances over the course of that 1966 season. In a November game against the New York Giants, which was the first win in Falcons history, Burke caught a touchdown pass. Granted, this was the 1966 Giants, and anyone and everyone was scoring on that putrid defense, but still, Burke caught a huge touchdown in the first half of that game. Against a Cowboys defense that was 4th in the NFL, and against one of the best teams in football as winners of the East, Burke had a team-high 5 catches for 84 yards. And in a game against his old team, the San Francisco 49ers, he got some revenge by posting 6 catches for 93 yards, having triple the number of receptions of any other Falcon, and more than double the number of receiving yards too. There weren't a whole lot of bright spots for the Falcons in 1966, but Burke was one of them, and he seemed like a pretty good building block for the future. However, in 1967, he was nowhere to be found, because during training camp in 1967, in a shock move that not a lot of people saw coming, head coach Norb Hecker decided to cut him. Bit of a surprise to say the least, cutting a young receiver who was really good for you last year. But I'm sure Hecker has a good justification and rationale for it. However, his rationale made such little sense that it made Falcon fans everywhere scratch their heads when they saw the news, and wonder what the heck this man was thinking. Said Hecker on July 26th, 2 months before the season was set to begin, on why he cut his receiver, Burke's knee just hadn't come around as expected. He told us he thought he would be ready in about a month, but we've got a lot of young, fast receivers here, and we can't afford to wait a month and lose the chance to keep one of the younger players. Again, Hecker's explanation boiled down to, Burke won't be ready for a bit, and we've got some young guys we want to look at. Which, might be the stupidest thing I've ever heard any coach say, because we need to break down this stupidity piece by piece. Number 1, you said that one of your reasons for the decision was that his knee injury was going to heal in a month. You know what a month is? A month takes you to August. You know when the season starts? September! You know when your first game of the season is? September 17th! The knee won't be ready for another month. And then, you still have another month after that until the season starts. If the season started tomorrow, okay, maybe I understand that explanation. But nope. This is like if you're trying to cast a Broadway show, and Idina Menzel really wants the role, and is perfect for the role, and the show starts previews in mid-May. However, she broke her leg, and she won't be able to perform until early April, because although the leg is broken, the recovery process is going well. So you decide to not cast her, and to pick someone who is way worse, and has way less pedigree. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, especially because it's not as though this sets you back from a rehearsal standpoint, since you have an understudy. That seems like a really stupid justification for not hiring someone. Well, that's what Norb Hecker did here, because even though Burke would have missed a grand total of 0 games, and would have even gone to play in half the preseason games, he was too impatient to make this work. Heck, he didn't even have to wait a month. As Burke said, I was surprised to say the least. My knee is strong and should be completely healed in 3 weeks, and I feel strong enough to play right now. If the season started today and he had to go, he wouldn't be at 100%, but he would be able to play. And you cut him for that reason? Huh? Number 2, you said that one of your reasons for the decision was for evaluation reasons, because you couldn't lose the chance to evaluate some of the players on the team. Well, you didn't have to cut the roster down to 60 until July 31st. This decision was made on July 26th. Do you know how many practices you have from that date until July 31st? If we assume 2 days, like most teams had, or heck, some teams even have 3 days, you've got a solid 10 more practices before you actually have to make your mind up per the league rules. You can't say that you needed to make this decision because you need all the practice time in the world to evaluate your players, and then not use that practice time to evaluate said players. It's like if I have a school project that's broken up into parts, where at the end, so let's say December 7th, you have to turn in a mass of paper, and on November 1st, you need to have X, Y, and Z done. But by October 1st, You need to turn in a one-paragraph proposal of what you're thinking about doing. It's September 26th, and you email your teacher and say, yeah, I won't be able to get this proposal to you in time. What do you mean? You still have another week before the deadline, and you just have to submit one paragraph. What do you mean you won't be able to get it in? You still have plenty of time to do so. Well, that was the logic that Norm Hecker applied here. But it gets even worse. Number 3, Hecker made it seem like Burke was this older guy. He made it seem like he was this older veteran who is depriving the younger players of getting a chance. So based on that, how old would you say Burke is? Would you guess he's a 32-year-old player? Maybe on the wrong side of 30? At worst, you might think that he's 29 years old. Well, he's not. He was 25 years old during the 1966 season. So unless you can age multiple years in 1 year, he was 26 years old entering 1967. How is he on the older side of things? No one in their right mind would argue that 26 is old. In fact, if you look at the wide receivers on the Falcons in 1966, to have over 100 yards receiving for the entire season, of which there were 3 of them in Alex Hawkins, Vern Burke, and Gary Barnes, Burke was the youngest of the 3 to do so. Burke started 8 games during that 1966 season, making him one of 21 players on the team to do so. Let's rank all 21 of these players by their age, and what do you know? Burke is on the younger side of things. So don't give me that nonsense about Burke being an older guy, when quite clearly, that is not the case. If the newer guys are freshmen, Burke is a sophomore. And number 4, based on everything Hecker said, you would think that the Falcons had a boatload of young receivers that they just had to take a look at, right? You would think that the Falcons drafted a ton of 21-year-olds and 22-year-olds at wide receiver, and they might have shown more potential than Burke. Well, aside from the fact that the 1967 Falcons had the worst draft class in NFL history, and I do not say that lightly, as their 16 draft picks combined to play a grand total of 0 games for the team, guess how many wide receivers the Falcons drafted? Go on, guess. 1. That's it. 1 receiver, and that was in the 9th round with a wideout out of Bishop by the name of Bobby Moden, who never ended up playing a game for the team. You're telling me that you cut Vern Burke because you had all these young receivers you had to get a look at, and in actuality, you only had 1 new receiver? How does that make any sense at all? Seriously, how does that make any sense? So just to recap Norm Hecker's logic for cutting the man you've been watching this whole time, because it makes no sense, and yes, I'm angry about a roster cut from roughly 60 years ago because of just how stupid this was. The Falcons cut the man because he would only be able to play starting in August, even though the season didn't start until September. And heck, he could have played now if he wanted to. The Falcons cut him because they wanted to have time to evaluate other guys, even though they did this a week before they actually had to submit those cuts. The Falcons cut him because he was on the older side of things, even though he was just 26 years old and was one of the youngest starters on the team in 1966, and the Falcons cut him because they had an influx of wide receivers that were young that they wanted to take a look at, even though they drafted just 1 receiver, and that was in the 9th round. They let a starter go for all of those reasons. Baffling. Absolutely baffling. And you wonder why Hecker was a garbage coach, and they ended that season with a 1-12-1 record. The great irony in all of this, when it came to this team behind me right here, is that Burke eventually got claimed off of waivers by the other team in the case behind me right here, as in their biggest rival, the New Orleans Saints. Vern Burke went from one expansion team to another. Now, Burke didn't do a whole lot in 1967. He did play, although 1967 would be his last season in the NFL. But still, this move made no sense whatsoever, and he probably could have made an impact on the Falcons in 1967. He had over 300 yards receiving during that 1966 season with the team. Only 1 player on the Falcons in 1967, Tommy McDonald, had more receiving yards in 67 than Burke had in 1966. So good job, Falcons. Genius roster construction all the way around. That's a one-win team right there. There have been many dumb reasons for players to be cut before. This one with Vern Burke is up there with one of the dumbest. Cutting a player who would have been ready well before the start of the season is stupid. Cutting a player who is too old, despite being on the younger side of things, is stupid. Cutting a player before you have to when your reasoning contradicts everything you just said is stupid. And cutting a player because you have to evaluate the other receivers on the team, even though you didn't get anyone new or younger, is stupid. No matter how you want to look at it, this was a stupid move. If the Falcons just cut Burke outright, alright, it'll be a bit of a surprise, don't get me wrong, but this would have been a non-story all these years later. But it's the explanation that made no sense and made you scratch your head and remember this stupidity roughly 6 decades later. If Hecker just said, we decided to go in a different direction, or we didn't like how he was progressing, fine, non-story. But to say this, to say all of this when it wasn't even true, when it came to Vern Burke, it was clear that when it came to roster construction, Norm Hecker had a lot to Vern. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.